Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I have been working as the town coroner for 17 years. For 17 years, the same fluorescent lights have been buzzing in the same basement room. The same iron drawers have been opening with that shrill sound I never got used to, and the same chemical smell has lingered on my clothes no matter how much I wash them. After a while, you start to think you've seen everything, every kind of death, every state the human body can assume when life abandons it. You develop a certain rhythm, a professional distance that preserves your sanity. In a town this small, where everybody on your table once shopped at Henderson's or sat 2 rows behind you in church, you have to. The call came on Tuesday evening, just as I was finishing the paperwork for a simple case earlier that week. 86-year-old Tom Merrick. Heart failure, just as you'd expect. There was that distinct flatness in Sheriff Davis's voice you hear when something is bothering him, but he can't quite put his finger on why. They'd found a body in room 12 of the Riverside Motel. A woman in her late 30s, no ID on her, no car in the parking lot, had paid cash for 3 nights, according to the motel owner. The housekeeper had found the body because she hadn't checked out on time. The motel was on the edge of town, the kind of place frequented more by long-haul truckers than tourists. It was a 2-story building, its paint peeling, the air conditioning units rattling as if trying to shake themselves loose. I had been there twice in my career, both times for overdose cases. Natural causes for people living unnatural lives, if you will. I packed my bag and went there, expecting more of the same. Room 12 was on the ground floor, its door held open by a cleaning cart. Sheriff Davis was outside smoking, something he only did when he was annoyed. He nodded at me but didn't say much, just stepped aside and let me in. The room looked like any other motel room I'd seen. A flowered bedspread, a landscape painting on the wall, a TV with static on the nightstand. The woman was lying on her back on the bed, arms at her sides, staring at the ceiling. She was wearing a plain white nightgown and no jewelry. Her dark hair was spread out on the pillow, almost neatly arranged, too neat for a sudden death. As usual, I approached the bed and put on my gloves, taking mental notes before touching anything. In her early 40s, I revised my estimate. She was perhaps 5'6" tall. She was thin, but not unhealthily so. There were no visible signs of trauma, no blood, no bruises as far as I could see from where I stood. Her eyes were open, which wasn't unusual, but there was something in her gaze that disturbed me. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Most dead eyes are empty, staring blankly. Hers, however, seemed to be looking at something. Just as a matter of procedure, I checked his pulse at his wrist. Of course, there was none. His skin was cool but not cold, indicating that the time of death was probably within the last 6 to 12 hours. Rigor mortis had not yet fully set in. It was just beginning in the jaw and fingers. I went through the checklist I had done hundreds of times before and took my notes. Then I noticed his hands. The position was wrong. His arms lay straight down at his sides, palms flat on the bed, fingers slightly splayed. It's not impossible for someone to die like this, but it's unusual. Most people, when death comes, show some kind of struggle, even if it's just the body's automatic response. Hands clench, arms pull up, muscles tense. This looked posed, intentional, as if someone had arranged her that way after the fact. I mentioned this to Davis, who was standing in the doorway. He grunted and jotted some things down in his own notebook. "The owner says the woman never left her room," he said. "She checked in Friday afternoon and indicated she didn't want to be disturbed. She didn't order any food, didn't make any calls from the room phone. The maid says there was a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door until checkout time this morning. Any idea who she might be? Nothing. No bag, no wallet, no phone. No car in the parking lot we can identify as hers. She paid cash and signed the register as Jane Smith. He said the name with a hint of suspicion. I examined the room more closely. There was no suitcase, no personal belongings in sight except for a half-full glass of water on the nightstand. The bathroom door was open, and I could see inside. Towels were folded, bathroom items untouched. It was as if she had checked in, put on her nightgown, and gone to bed to die. "I'll have to take her to the morgue," I said. "I can't say anything more here." Davis nodded. "The coroner's van is on its way. I'll take photos for the file, but between us, this situation seems strange to me. I don't know why yet." I understood what he meant. Sometimes, even without being able to explain exactly what it is, you can sense that something is wrong. A lifetime of looking at bodies gives you instincts that don't always match the official reports. The car arrived and we carried him onto the stretcher. He wasn't very heavy. He was easier to move than I expected. As we lifted him, his head rolled slightly to the side, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Behind his left ear, barely visible in his hair, was a small mark. It wasn't rotten or cut. It almost looked like a birthmark, but it was very perfect. A small circle, maybe the size of a penny, slightly darker than the surrounding skin. I made a note to examine it more closely during the autopsy. In the morgue, I laid him on the table and slowly performed the external examination. This is the part most people don't understand about this profession. They think it's all about cutting people open and examining their organs, looking for definitive evidence. But the real work lies in the details, in the small observations that paint a picture of what happened. Every body tells a story if you know how to read it. As standard procedure, I photographed her from every angle. Under the bright examination lights, I could see her more clearly. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, no signs of sexual assault, no needle marks, no indication she used drugs. Her nails were clean and neatly trimmed. There was a thin gold ring on her right ring finger, but it had no inscription or distinguishing mark. A simple ring that could have been bought from any jeweler. I carefully removed her nightgown, and although I wasn't sure what crime had been committed, I put it in a bag as evidence. There were no marks on her body except for a small circle behind her ear. I examined it with a magnifying glass. The edges were too sharp to be natural. It almost looked like it had been burned into the skin, but there was no scar or tissue damage. Just a perfect circle with slightly darker pigmentation. The autopsy began quite normally. A Y incision, the standard opening of the chest cavity. The ribs separated with their usual resistance. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. The heart looked healthy, perhaps a little smaller than average, but within normal parameters. The lungs were clear, no fluid, no signs of disease. I worked methodically, removing and weighing each organ, taking tissue samples, taking notes. I detected the first real abnormality in his stomach. It was completely empty. Not only was there no food, it was empty in a way that indicated he hadn't eaten anything for days. There was a slight atrophy of the stomach lining, the kind of change seen in people suffering from starvation, but there were no signs of malnutrition in the rest of his body. His muscle tone was normal, his organs were of healthy weight. This didn't make sense. I moved on to the other organs to find anything that could explain his death. The liver was clean. The kidneys were functioning normally before death. There were no signs of poisoning, no toxins I could detect without sending a sample to the state lab. I took blood for a full toxicology screen, but my gut told me it would come back negative. Then I opened the skull. The brain is usually one of the easiest organs to examine. You make incisions, pull back the scalp, use a saw to open the skull, and there it is. The human brain is incredibly fragile for such an important organ, and if death occurred in the brain, it usually shows clear signs of what killed the person: bleeding, clots, tumors, trauma, something. There was nothing wrong with his brain. In fact, it was too perfect. The tissue was sound, the color was good, there were no signs of disease in the blood vessels. I had never seen such a healthy-looking brain in a dead person. I examined it carefully for anything unusual. There was nothing. No bleeding, no lesions, no abnormalities I could detect. I stepped back from the table, removed my gloves, and tried to make sense of what I had seen. Or rather, what I hadn't seen. In 17 years, I had never completed an autopsy without finding the cause of death. Even in unclear cases, there was always something. The heart stopped for this reason. The lungs failed for that reason. The brain shut down because of something else. There is always a reason. This woman had simply stopped. Every organ was healthy. Every system had been functioning normally until the moment it stopped. It was as if someone had turned off a switch. I checked the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. I'd been working for about 4 hours and was no closer to an answer than when I started. I put my gloves back on and examined her body once more, inch by inch, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed her eyes. Before starting the autopsy, out of respect, I had closed her eyes as standard procedure. But now they were open again. Not completely, just slightly, as if looking out from behind the eyelids. I must have bumped his head during the examination, I thought. These things happen sometimes. Bodies move, muscles relax, things shift. I reached out to close his eyes again and paused. The size of his pupils had changed. When I first examined him at the motel, I had noticed that both pupils were moderately dilated, equal in size, and fixed. That's what you'd expect in a corpse. But now, the right pupil was noticeably larger than the left. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was enough for me to see it. I stood there for a long time, looking at his face, thinking about possible explanations. Pupils do not change after death. They cannot. There is no mechanism for it. The muscles that control dilation are controlled by the nervous system, and the nervous system shuts down when you die. To be absolutely sure I hadn't made a mistake, I checked my initial notes. No, I had specifically noted that the pupils were equal in size and moderately dilated. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or that I had made a mistake in my initial examination. I was tired. It had been a long day. I measured both pupils with a pupilometer and recorded the measurements. Right pupil, 7 millimeters, left pupil, 4 millimeters. A significant difference I couldn't explain. I closed her eyes again, tightly this time, and covered her face with a surgical drape. I needed to finish my examination and write my preliminary report. I could think about the details later. I turned my attention back to the marks behind her ear. Under the examination lights and with my magnifying equipment, I could see the marks more clearly. It was definitely not a birthmark. The pigmentation was too even, too precise. It almost looked like a tattoo, but there was no ink I could detect beneath the skin. I took a small biopsy from the prominent area, thinking maybe the state lab could determine the cause. As I prepared to close him up, I heard a noise somewhere in the building. Maybe a door was closing or something was falling. The morgue is in the basement of the county building, and I should have been the only one here at this hour. I called out to see if anyone was there. There was no answer, only the hum of the refrigeration units and the buzz of the fluorescent lights. I went back to my work and closed the chest with my usual efficiency. I wrote down my preliminary findings, sent the samples to the state lab, and began waiting for the toxicology results. Sometimes you can't determine the cause of death right away. Sometimes it takes weeks, months, or never becomes entirely clear. It wasn't satisfying, but that was the reality of the job. As I was finishing the last stitch, I heard the sound again. This time, it was definitely footsteps, above me, in one of the offices upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I listened for a moment, then shook my head. The building is old, it makes noises, and the sheriff's office is on the first floor. Probably someone else was working late like me. I covered the body with a sheet and began cleaning my tools. That's when I noticed the glass of water brought from the motel room. I had had it brought along with his other belongings to test whether he had drunk anything before he died. It was still there where I had left it, on the counter, half full. But now it was empty. The inside of the glass was dry, as if it had been empty for hours. I stood there for a long time looking at the glass, trying to remember if I had emptied it and forgotten. I was tired. It had been a long autopsy. Maybe I had emptied it to clean it and didn't remember. That must have been it. I heard footsteps again, closer now, as if on the stairs leading down to the basement. I walked to the door and opened it, looking into the hallway. The hallway was empty, lit by the same fluorescent lights that hummed in every room of this building. All the doors were closed. No one was there. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed faintly in the empty hallway. There was no answer. I returned to the autopsy room and locked the door behind me. I didn't like feeling the need to do this, but something about this empty building was unsettling me tonight. I had worked late into the night here many times before, often alone, with only the bodies for company, and it had never bothered me before. But tonight was different. I finished cleaning and began writing my preliminary report at the desk in the corner of the room. Cause of death: toxicology and histology results pending. I noted all the normal findings, all the healthy organs, everything that should have kept this woman alive but didn't. I noted the empty stomach, the abnormal mark behind her ear, and after a moment's hesitation, I noted the difference in the size of her pupils, even though I couldn't explain it. As I wrote the last paragraph, the lights flickered. It was just a moment, a brief power outage that caused the fluorescent lights to buzz louder for a second. I looked up at the ceiling to see if they would go out completely, but the lights stabilized. Old building, old wiring. It happened sometimes. I looked back at the corpse on the table. The sheet I had covered it with had shifted slightly, exposing one shoulder and part of the face. It was clear I hadn't placed it carefully enough. I got up to fix it, and as I approached the table, I saw his eyes open again. They weren't slightly open like before. They were fully open. He was staring straight up at the ceiling. I stood there, gripping the edge of the examination table with my hands, telling myself there was a logical explanation. Gas buildup in the body cavity, muscle spasms, something. I had seen corpses do strange things before. I had seen them sit up when rigor mortis set in, make noises as air escaped their lungs, all sorts of things that could scare you if you didn't know what you were looking at. But I had never seen eyes open on their own before. Not like this, especially not after closing them twice. I reached out with my gloved hand and closed the eyes again, making sure with my fingers that the eyelids were properly positioned. For a moment, I held the closed eyes slowly with my hand. The eyes remained closed. I exhaled without realizing I was holding my breath. When I returned to my desk to finish the report, I heard a soft sound behind me. A rustling sound, like fabric moving. I turned quickly. He was sitting at the desk. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. I couldn't process what I was seeing. He was sitting upright, the sheet down to his waist, his hands in his lap. His eyes were open and he was looking at me. Not staring blankly like before. He was looking at me. When I staggered backward and knocked over my chair, she turned her head slightly, following my movements. This was impossible. She was dead. I had performed a complete autopsy. I had removed her organs, weighed them, examined them, and put them back. I had cut open her skull and examined her brain. There is no coming back from something like that. No coming back. But she was sitting there. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was closed. My heart was beating excessively fast in my chest. He tilted his head slightly, still watching me, and I saw his lips moving. No sound came out, but I could see his mouth forming words. I had to get away. I had to get out of that room immediately, lock the door behind me, call for help. But I couldn't move. I froze there, watching this impossible thing happen in front of me. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed at me. His finger was steady, not trembling or wobbling. It was pointing directly at my chest. His mouth kept moving, forming the same silent words over and over. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, just above a whisper, but in the silent room I heard every word clearly. "You don't see yet." I found my voice. "What? What don't I see?" She didn't answer. She just kept pointing at me, kept saying the same silent words, and I realized with cold clarity that her lips didn't match the sounds I heard. The voice was coming from somewhere else. Maybe behind me, or everywhere at once. The lights flickered again, this time longer, plunging the room into darkness for a full second, then came back on. When the lights came back on, the woman was lying there again, just like before. Arms at her sides, eyes closed, the sheet pulled up to her shoulders, as if nothing had happened. I stood there breathless, my back against the wall, staring at the table. Had I imagined it? Had I fallen asleep at my desk and seen all this in a dream? I looked at the overturned chair, the only proof that I had moved. I forced myself to approach the desk again, slowly, ready to run if there was any movement. But she was still just a corpse. I checked her eyelids. They were closed. I touched her shoulder. Cold skin, the onset of rigor mortis had stiffened her. She was dead, completely dead, as he had been for hours. With trembling hands, I gathered my notes, filed my report, and left. I didn't run, but I walked quickly, turning off the lights as I went, locking the doors behind me. I took the stairs 2 at a time to the ground floor and went out to the parking lot where my car was waiting. It was 3 in the morning, and the town was completely dark except for a few streetlights. I sat in my car for a long time, my hands on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a hallucination caused by stress, exhaustion, or the chemical fumes in the autopsy room. But I couldn't forget the way he sat there, his eyes meeting mine, that voice saying, "You don't see it yet." I went home and didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I called Sheriff Davis and told him my preliminary findings. Cause of death was undetermined, more tests were needed. He asked if there was anything suspicious, anything that might suggest murder. I said no. As far as I could tell, everything looked natural. We would have to wait for the lab results. I didn't tell him the rest. What could I say? That the body sat up and talked to me? That its eyes opened and closed on their own? I would have sounded crazy. That morning, after drinking coffee, taking a shower, and convincing myself to act professional, I returned to the morgue. I had to transfer the body to cold storage until I could identify it and notify the next of kin. I had to pack up all my samples for the state lab. I had to act as if everything was normal. The autopsy room was exactly as I had left it. The examination table was clean, my instruments were in place, my notes were filed. I unlocked the drawer where I had put it and opened the drawer. It wasn't there. He hadn't dramatically vanished. The drawer wasn't empty. There was a body in it. But it wasn't him. It was a man, maybe 60 years old, who had died in a traffic accident 2 weeks ago and was still waiting to be claimed by his distant family. I knew where every body in this morgue was. I had put them there. I checked every drawer. There were 14 bodies in total, all in their proper places exactly where they should be, except for the woman in room 12. She wasn't there. I called Davis immediately. He came with 2 assistants and we searched the entire building. We checked every room, every cabinet, every place a body could be. Nothing. She was gone. The security camera footage showed me arriving with the body the night before, working alone in the autopsy room for hours, and leaving around 3 in the morning. It showed no one else entering or leaving the building. It didn't show me removing the body. The body had vanished from a locked drawer in a locked room. Davis asked if I was sure I had actually brought it to the morgue. Maybe I had left it at the motel? But the transfer documents were in the file, signed by me and the ambulance driver. The photos I took were on my camera. My autopsy notes were complete and detailed, describing a body that had definitely been on my table. We returned to the motel. Room 12 had already been cleaned and rented to someone else. The manager said he had disposed of the bedding and towels as usual. No, he hadn't noticed anything unusual. No, he didn't know what had happened to the woman found dead there. All my notes from that night are still with me. The photos, the tissue samples I took, the preliminary autopsy report. But the samples disappeared from the evidence locker before they could be sent to the state lab. The photos show the examination table, my tools, the usual layout of the autopsy room. But now, when I look closely at them, I don't see a body on the table, just an empty sheet. Davis eventually closed the case. No body, no ID, no proof that anyone had died. He said maybe I was working too hard, maybe I needed some rest. He didn't say it accusingly, more like a genuine concern. Maybe I had imagined it all, he said. Fallen asleep at the motel and seen the whole autopsy in my dreams. I wanted to believe that. I tried to believe that. But 3 days after the woman disappeared, I saw it while shaving in the bathroom mirror. It was barely visible behind my left ear, in my hair. A small mark, maybe the size of a penny, slightly darker than the skin around it. A perfect circle. I touched it with my finger, but it felt like nothing. No pain, no warmth, no texture. Just smooth skin that was darker than it should be. I still see it every morning when I shave. I had 3 different doctors examine it. They all said the same thing, just a birthmark. It was probably there my whole life, but I just hadn't noticed it before. But I know better. I know it wasn't there before that night. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I can hear that sound again, soft as a whisper, coming from no particular direction. You don't see it yet. I've been working as the coroner here for 17 years. I've seen every kind of death this town has to offer, but I still don't understand what I saw that night. The thing sitting at my desk. The thing that spoke to me. The mark it left behind my ear like a signature. And worst of all, I'm starting to think it's right. I don't see it yet. Whatever it is I'm supposed to see, whatever that mark means, I don't understand it yet. But I think I will, eventually. And I'm very afraid of what that moment will be like. The thing about drowning victims is that they almost always look peaceful. People expect them to look panicked, frozen in their final, desperate moments. But that's not how it works. The moment they're pulled from the water, the struggle is over. Their faces relax. Their bodies relax. If you didn't know better, you'd think they'd just fallen asleep and drifted away. Michael Porter didn't look peaceful. They pulled him out of Mercy Lake one Thursday afternoon in late October. Around 4 o'clock, I got a call from Chen's assistant telling me to come to the boat dock immediately. A fisherman had spotted something floating near the old dock on the east shore. It took 2 hours to retrieve the body because it was caught in the branches of a tree submerged in the water. When I arrived, they had laid the body on a tarp in the gravel parking lot, and I understood why Chen had sounded shaken on the phone. Michael Porter was 28 years old. I knew him a little, as you know most people in a town this size. He worked at the hardware store on Main Street, was always polite, and would help me whenever I needed to pick up supplies for repairs at the morgue. He had been married for 3 years to a woman named Sarah, who was a second-grade teacher at the elementary school. They didn't have children yet. They had a small house on Maple Street with a garden that Sarah constantly shared on Facebook. He had been reported missing 6 days ago. He had left for work on Friday morning but never arrived. His car was found in the hardware store parking lot, keys still in the ignition, his wallet and phone on the passenger seat. No note, no explanation, no clue as to where he had gone. The sheriff's department was searching, but Mercy Lake was 3 miles from town, in the opposite direction of his usual route. There was no reason for him to be there. I knelt beside the body and began my preliminary examination. He was fully clothed, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, his work boots still laced up. His skin looked pale and waterlogged, as you'd expect after days underwater. But his face was strange. His eyes were open, which isn't unusual for drowning victims. What was unusual was his expression. His mouth was open wider than normal, as if his jaw had been pulled out. His eyes were swollen, the capillaries burst and red. Every muscle in his face seemed frozen in an expression of absolute terror. I had seen drowning victims struggle in panic in their final moments, but I had never seen anything like this before. He looked as if he were screaming lifelessly. "My God," Chen said behind me. "What happened to him?" I didn't answer. I was busy trying to make sense of what I saw. At this time of year, the water temperature of Mercy Lake is about 45 degrees. Even if you don't drown, it's cold enough to kill you from hypothermia within a few hours. But Michael's expression showed he had died within seconds, not hours. He had died in utter terror. I checked his hands. There were no defensive wounds. There was no tissue under his fingernails. His palms were clean except for being softened from prolonged exposure to water. I looked for any signs of trauma, anything that might indicate he had been attacked before entering the water. Nothing stood out. There were no bruises on his throat, no marks on his wrists or ankles indicating he had been restrained. "We need to take him back to the morgue," I said. "I can't say anything more here." Sheriff Davis had arrived while I was examining the body. He stood a few yards away, smoking a cigarette and looking out at the lake. "His wife called me this morning," he said. "She asked if we had checked the lake. She said she saw him in the water last night in a dream. I thought it was just grief, you know, the mind trying to make sense of things. But I sent Chen out here anyway, and of course..." He cut himself off and took a long drag on his cigarette. "Do you think he committed suicide?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I'll have more information and data after the autopsy." We loaded him into the coroner's van and returned to the morgue. By the time I placed him on the examination table, it was getting dark, and I was alone in the building. I often prefer it that way. There are fewer distractions, no one looking over my shoulder asking questions I don't yet know the answers to. I started with photographs, documenting everything before touching him: the deformed face, the water-soaked clothes, the general condition of the body. Then I began to remove his clothes, cutting carefully in case there was evidence I needed to preserve. The shirt came off easily, but when I started on the jeans, I noticed something strange. The fabric around the ankles was torn, not cut or worn, as if something had grabbed it and ripped the fabric. I examined it more closely with a magnifying glass. The tears were irregular, almost like claw marks, but that didn't make sense. There was nothing large enough in Mercy Lake to cause this kind of damage. There were only catfish and perch, but they don't attack living humans. I put the clothes in a bag and continued the external examination. The body was in the early stages of decomposition, as expected after 6 days in cold water. But there were some abnormalities. The fingertips were torn, not from decay, but from something else. It looked as if he had been desperately scratching at something, hard enough to tear his skin and nails. But there were no traces under his nails, nothing to indicate what he had been scratching. I gently turned him over to check his back and found more tears in the skin along his spine. They weren't deep cuts, just superficial scratches in parallel lines from his shoulders to his waist. There were 4 lines on each side, evenly spaced. It was as if something with claws had dragged him down. I stepped back from the table and removed my gloves. This didn't make sense. Every detail I found indicated that Michael had died violently, that he had fought something, but there was absolutely no evidence of what that something was. There was no foreign DNA, no animal hair, no plant matter that shouldn't have been there. There was just a body that had clearly been attacked in the water, but the attacker was nowhere to be found. I began the internal examination around 8 o'clock. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling hummed, a familiar sound that usually helped me focus. Tonight, however, it was oppressive, too loud, filling the silence and making me realize how alone I was here. I opened the chest with a Y-shaped incision and immediately noticed the water. There was more water than I expected. It had filled the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity. Drowned victims have water in their lungs, of course, but this was excessive. It was as if every part of the body was filled with water. There was water everywhere. First, I examined his lungs. They were filled with water, but the tissue didn't look normal either. Normally, during drowning, foam forms in the airways because water and air mix during the last desperate breaths. There was no foam in Michael's lungs. The water inside them was clear, completely clear, as if it had been poured in after he died. But that's not how drowning happens. You inhale water because you're trying to breathe, because your body demands oxygen and doesn't care that you're underwater. The struggle itself creates the foam, the characteristic appearance of drowning. This looked as if someone had filled his lungs with water after his heart had stopped. I removed the lungs and set them aside for closer examination. I moved on to the heart. It was slightly enlarged, the right ventricle swollen. Again, not unusual in drowning victims. Even when the lungs can't supply oxygen, the right side of the heart continues to pump, causing blood to back up and the chamber to swell. But when I opened the heart, I saw it was filled with water too. Not blood, water. Clear, clean water that shouldn't have been there. I took water samples from the chest cavity and the heart. I would send them to the state lab to see if they matched the water from Lake Mercy. Sometimes, in drowning cases, diatoms, microscopic algae that enter the bloodstream during the final desperate breaths, can be found. These can definitively tell you if someone drowned, and even potentially where they drowned. I hoped the water samples would give me some answers. I continued the autopsy, removing and examining each organ. Everything was filled with water, far more than it should have been. His stomach was nearly filled with 2 liters of lake water. His intestines were swollen with water. Even his bladder was filled with water instead of urine. It was as if his entire body had become a vessel for the lake, altering everything within it. Then I opened the skull. The brain should have been relatively preserved. The skull is a watertight, closed cavity. Even in drowning victims, the brain usually shows secondary effects, hypoxia damage from lack of oxygen, but the tissue remains relatively intact. Michael's brain was filled with water. When I removed the top of his skull, the water literally poured out. flowing down the sides of his head onto the examination table. The brain had swollen enough to press against the inside of the skull, and when I tried to remove it, the tissue was so saturated with water that it began to disintegrate in my hands. I had never seen anything like it. I had never read about anything like it in medical literature. It was as if Michael Porter had somehow absorbed the entire lake into his body. It was as if the water had found every void, every cavity, every cell, and completely filled them. As I washed my hands at the sink, I tried to make sense of what I had found. The cause of death was clearly drowning, but the mechanism was completely wrong. People drown because water enters their lungs and prevents gas exchange. They die from lack of oxygen. They don't die because their entire bodies are filled with water like a sponge. I turned back to examine his face more closely. That look of horror was still there, frozen in place by rigor mortis. I looked into his eyes, or what was left of them after 6 days in the water, and saw something I had missed before. There was sediment in his eyes, not just around them, but inside them too. Small particles of mud and sediment embedded in the cornea, as if he had been staring directly at the bottom of the lake with his eyes open. I scooped out some of the sediment for examination with a small scoop. Under the microscope, it appeared to be ordinary lake mud. There was nothing unusual about it, but it had entered his eyes as if he had been pressed face down with great force. But when they found him, they said he was floating face down. Chen had specifically mentioned this. The fisherman had seen his face, realized he was human, and that's why he reported it. I took notes on everything, trying to piece together a coherent picture from all these conflicting details. Drowned at a depth of 2 meters, but filled with water in a way inconsistent with drowning. While floating face down, there was lake mud in his eyes, as if he had been pressed face down. A horrified expression indicating he had died within seconds, but a body that had been in the water for 6 days. It was almost midnight when I heard the dripping sound. I looked up from my notes. The autopsy room was silent except for the usual hum of the equipment and the faint buzz of the lights. But I definitely heard water dripping, the slow, steady sound of drops hitting the tiles. I stood up and looked around. As far as I could see, there was no leak. There was no water on the floor except for the water flowing from Michael's body during the examination. I walked around the room, listening to the sound, trying to find its source. The sound was coming from the examination table. I approached slowly. Michael's body was still open, the organs I had removed sitting on the examination trays beside him. The dripping sound was coming from inside the chest cavity. I looked closer and saw that clear water was gushing from somewhere deep inside his body and dripping onto the table. This was impossible. I had removed all his organs. There was nothing left there that could produce water. There was only an empty cavity, the ribs and spine I'd cut through. But the water kept flowing, pooling at the bottom of his chest and spilling onto the table. I reached for a sample jar and tried to collect some of the water, but my hand was shaking so much that I spilled most of it. The water was cold, much colder than room temperature, cold enough to feel through my gloves. It smelled like Mercy Lake, that distinctive mineral scent of deep water and mud. The dripping accelerated. Now it was dripping not just from his chest, but from his stomach, from the hollow where I had removed his brain. Water was seeping from every hole I had made in his body, flowing in impossible quantities. The examination table couldn't drain the water fast enough. Water began to spill onto the floor, forming a spreading puddle on the tiles. I stepped back, watching in horror as more and more water flowed from the body. It wasn't dripping anymore. It was flowing as if the body were finally connected to an underground reservoir. The puddle of water on the floor spread toward my feet, and I stumbled backward, knocking over my stool. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The flow of water stopped. The room was silent again, Except for the hum of the fluorescent lights, I stood there, panting, staring at the puddle of water covering half the autopsy room. I looked at the body again. Michael Porter lay on the table, just as he was, empty, examined, dead. The water had stopped flowing from the cavities in his body. Everything had stopped. I grabbed a mop from the supply closet and started cleaning up the water. My hands were still shaking. I told myself it was just fluids, that I had missed something during the examination, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for what had just happened. Bodies sometimes do strange things. Gas buildup can cause fluids to leak out. It wasn't impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I finished cleaning up and began closing the body. I sutured the Y incision, replaced the skull cap, and performed the standard post-autopsy procedures. While my hands performed the familiar motions, my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I was almost done when I noticed a change in his expression. Not dramatically, not immediately noticeable, but the mouth, which had been stretched in horror, was now closed, almost relaxed. The bulging eyes were now sunken into their sockets. The face, which had looked like he had died screaming, now looked almost peaceful. I checked my photos to make sure I wasn't imagining things. No, I was right. The previous photos clearly showed the expression of horror, but now Michael Porter, lying on my desk with his chest heaving, looked as if he had died in his sleep. I finished my work quickly. I covered the body with a sheet. I took notes for the official report. Cause of death: drowning due to suffocation. Manner of death: further investigation pending. I didn't mention the water flowing from the cavities in his body. I didn't mention the changing expression. I didn't mention the sediment that had entered his eyes, even though he was found face down. I locked up the morgue and went home. I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee until morning, watching the sky outside my window slowly lighten. Sheriff Davis called me the next morning. They had found Michael's car keys in the Mercy Lake parking lot near where the body was found. They must have been there all along, but had been overlooked during the initial search. The keys were found on the ground next to a tree about 20 feet from the water's edge. But there were no footprints leading from the keys to the lake. The ground was soft mud, perfect for leaving prints. If Michael had walked toward the water, there should have been tracks, but there was nothing. Only the keys, lying on the ground as if they had fallen from above. Sarah Porter came to identify the body that afternoon. I had cleaned it up as best I could, made it presentable. She stood by the examination table for a long time, held his hand, cried silently. Then she looked at me. "Did he suffer?" she asked. I shouldn't have said no. I should have reassured her that he had died quickly, peacefully, and without pain. But I looked at her face, remembered that look of utter horror, and couldn't lie. "I don't know," I said. She nodded, as if that was the answer she had been expecting. "Every night since he disappeared, I've seen him in my dreams," she said quietly. "The same dream every night. Underwater, in the dark, and something was pulling him down. He was trying to come up, but he couldn't. Something was holding him." She wiped her eyes. "In the dream, he was calling me, but because of the water, I couldn't hear him. I could only see his mouth moving, calling my name. Then the water got into his mouth and eyes, and he filled with water, as if the lake wanted to fill him with water." I shivered. "Mrs. Porter, I know it's just a dream," she interrupted. "I know, but it felt real. Every night I watched him drown, something pulling him down. When I woke up, I could still feel the water, as if I were drowning too." She looked at her husband's body. "Does he look peaceful to you?" I looked at her face. "Yes," I said honestly. "Good," she said. "That's good. At least it's over now." A few minutes later, she left. I had to deliver the body to the funeral home that afternoon, but I wanted to examine it one more time first. Sarah's dream was troubling me, the way it matched what I saw. The look of horror, the water-filled body. I lifted the sheet and looked at Michael once more. And I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On his chest, just below his collarbone, there was a mark. Small, circular, about the size of a quarter. The skin was slightly wrinkled, like an old scar, but I knew it hadn't been there during the autopsy. I had examined every inch of his body. I would have seen it. I looked closer. The mark was a perfect circle, and in the center, barely visible, was a small amount of water. Just a drop, a bead on the surface of his skin. I touched it with my finger, and it was ice cold. I wiped it away and watched another drop form in the same spot. Then another. Slowly, as if the mark were leaking water from the depths of the body. I covered it again and called the funeral home. They could take it. I didn't want to examine that mark any further. I didn't want to know what it meant. The toxicology report came back 2 weeks later. There were no drugs, no alcohol, nothing that shouldn't have been in his body. The water samples I took from his chest cavity and heart were analyzed and compared to samples taken from Mercy Lake. They matched perfectly. Same mineral content, same pH, same microscopic organisms. He had definitely drowned in Mercy Lake, or at least the water filling his body came from there. The diatom test was inconclusive. They found diatoms in his blood, confirming he had drowned, but the diatom species didn't match anything currently living in Mercy Lake. The lab said they appeared to come from a much deeper, colder body of water, probably from somewhere that existed thousands of years ago, before the lake was formed. I prepared my final report. Cause of death: drowning. Manner of death: accidental or suicide, undetermined. Case closed. But I kept thinking about what Sarah had said, about something pulling her down, about the lake wanting to fill her up, and I kept thinking about that mark on her chest, about the very old, very cold, flowing water from a lake long gone. 2 months later, Sarah Porter moved away. She sold her house, quit her teaching job, and left town without saying goodbye to anyone. I heard she went west, somewhere far from water. I don't blame her. If I could have left, I would have. But I'm still here, and sometimes, when I go to other calls, I pass by Mercy Lake. And every time I make sure I drive fast enough not to have to look at the lake. Because sometimes, late at night when the light is just right, I could swear I see something moving beneath the surface. A dark, large thing, turning in the deep water where Michael Porter drowned. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm working alone in the morgue, I can hear it. The sound of water dripping onto the tiles, slow and steady, coming from somewhere I can't locate. I tell myself it's just the pipes. Old building, old plumbing. But I know the truth. The lake is still here, and I think it's still hungry. The Peterson house had been empty for 11 months when they found Eleanor Marsh inside. 11 months since the bank foreclosed and the family moved out in the middle of the night. They'd left behind furniture that wouldn't fit in the U-Haul and, presumably, memories they wanted to forget. The house was on Ridgemont Avenue. This street had been a nice street when the factory was still operating. People had steady jobs, and they had the money to maintain their properties. Now, it was just an ordinary street filled with sagging porches and overgrown lawns, windows covered with sheets or plywood, and, for sale, signs that never came down. No one went into the Petersons' house. There was no reason to. The real estate agent had stopped showing the house after the first few months. The neighborhood kids, as they always did with empty houses, said it was haunted, but they still stayed away. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because in this town, empty houses meant squatters or drug users, the kind of people you wouldn't want to encounter in the dark of night. So when their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, called 911 saying a terrible smell was coming from the Petersons' house, Sheriff Davis asked me to meet him there. It was a Tuesday morning in March, cold and gray, the kind of day when the sun never broke through the clouds. I arrived at the house around 10 a.m., and Davis was already there, standing on the sidewalk with Mrs. Chen, both of them breathing heavily. I didn't need to ask what the smell was. After 17 years on the job, you develop a nose that can pick up the smell of death. It's a thick, sweet smell that sticks in the back of your throat and lingers in your nose for hours. The Peterson home was emitting this smell in waves, even with all the doors and windows closed. "How long do you think it's been?" Davis asked, as I put on my gloves and grabbed my field kit from the van. "Hard to say from here, at least a week, maybe longer." I looked at the house. It was a 2-story, white-painted house with peeling paint and crooked shutters. All the windows were dark. "Did you check inside?" "I waited for you. Mrs. Chen said she started noticing the smell 3 days ago, but thought it was a dead animal in the attic. She didn't call the police until this morning when the smell got worse." We climbed the front stairs, the wood creaking beneath our feet. The front door was locked, but Davis had a key from the real estate company. When he opened the door, the smell hit us like a wall, so strong that Davis actually gagged and stepped back. "God," he muttered, pulling his shirt over his nose. I'd smelled worse, but not by much. We went inside, me with my flashlight in front, Davis behind me with his hand on his gun, both of us knowing that whoever was in here was no longer a threat to anyone. The interior of the house was dim, all the curtains drawn, dust swirling in the light of my flashlight. The Petersons' furniture was still there. A sagging sofa, a coffee table with water stains, a dark, non-working television in the corner. Everything looked abandoned, with that particular kind of silence found in places where no one has lived for a long time. We found her in the kitchen. Eleanor Marsh was 73 years old, a widow living alone in a small apartment above a hardware store in the city center. I had seen her at the market, at the post office, the kind of elderly woman who was invisible in a small town because she was always there, and everyone assumed she always would be. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her head resting on her arms, leaning forward as if she had fallen asleep while waiting for someone. She had been dead for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. Decomposition had set in. Her skin was blotchy and discolored, her body bloated with gas. But what struck me immediately was her posture. She looked comfortable, even peaceful, as if she had decided to take a little nap at the table. I approached cautiously. The kitchen was cleaner than the rest of the house. There was no dust on the counters, no cobwebs in the corners. Someone lived here, or at least spent time here. There were dishes in the sink, a coffee cup on the counter, a newspaper on the table dated 2 weeks ago. "What was he doing here?" Davis called from the doorway. He wasn't coming closer. The smell in the kitchen was overwhelming. "I don't know yet." I examined the table around him. The newspaper was open to the obituaries. There was a pen next to it, and someone had circled several entries in red. I recognized the names. They were all townspeople who had died last year. Marcus Webb, 62, had died of a heart attack. Linda Doyle, 58, had died of cancer. James Pritchard, 71, had suffered a stroke. Eleanor's hand was next to the pen, her fingers slightly curled as if she had been holding it when she died. I looked closer at the obituaries. Someone had written notes in the margins, the dates and times, addresses. I realized with a cold feeling that these were funeral details. When the services had been held, where people were buried. I photographed everything, then carefully moved her hand to check for rigor mortis. It had come and gone, meaning she'd been dead at least 3 days, probably longer given the state of decomposition. Her skin was cold and waxy, starting to separate from the underlying tissue. "We need to move her to the morgue," I said. "I can't tell you much more here." Davis called for the van, while I did a preliminary examination. No obvious signs of trauma. No wounds, no bruising, no indication of violence. Her clothes were neat, a simple house dress and cardigan, sensible shoes. She looked like she'd gotten dressed for a normal day and then just stopped being alive. I checked her purse, which was sitting on the chair beside her. Wallet with $17, ID, insurance cards. A small address book. A key ring with half a dozen keys. A bottle of prescription medication for high blood pressure. The pills rattling when I shook it. Everything you'd expect to find in an old woman's purse. But there was also a photograph. Old, creased, the colors faded. It showed a young couple standing in front of this house. The Peterson house. Back when it was new and the paint was fresh and the yard was full of flowers. The man was tall and dark-haired, grinning at the camera. The woman beside him was blonde and pretty, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. On the back of the photo, someone had written in careful cursive, "Our first home, August 1968. I showed it to Davis. "The Petersons." He looked at it and nodded. "That's Robert Peterson and his wife Carol. This was their house for 40 years before they lost it." "Did Eleanor Marsh know them?" "Not that I'm aware of. Why?" I didn't answer. I was looking at the photograph again, at the happy couple standing in front of their new home, and I was wondering why Eleanor Marsh had died holding it. We got her loaded into the van, and I drove back to the morgue. It was almost noon by then, gray light filtering through the basement windows, the fluorescent tubes flickering to life when I flipped the switch. I transferred her to the examination table and began the process of documenting everything before I started the actual autopsy. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, thin to the point of frailty. Her white hair was neatly arranged, like she'd brushed it that morning. Her nails were trimmed and clean. She looked like someone who took care of herself, who maintained dignity even living alone on a fixed income in the apartment above a hardware store. I removed her clothing carefully, bagging each item. Under her dress, she wore old-fashioned undergarments, the kind women her age still preferred. Everything was clean and neatly pressed. In the pocket of her cardigan, I found a handkerchief, monogrammed with the initials EM, and something else. A small key, brass, old-fashioned, the kind that might open a diary or a jewelry box. I set it aside and continued the examination. The decomposition made it difficult to assess some things, but I could see she'd been in relatively good health before she died. No obvious signs of disease, no tumors, no indications of chronic illness beyond the high blood pressure medication I'd found in her purse. Her body showed the normal wear of 73 years, arthritis in her fingers, some degeneration in her spine, but nothing that would kill her. I started the internal examination around 2 p.m. The Y incision opened her up and the smell got worse, which I'd expected. Decomposition produces gases, fluids, all the biological processes of breaking down. But underneath that, there was something else. A different smell, faint but distinct. Sweet, almost floral, like perfume. I examined her organs one by one. The heart was small but healthy for her age. No signs of infarction or disease. The lungs were clear. No fluid, no indication of respiratory failure. The liver showed some age-related changes, but nothing significant. Everything I found suggested she should have lived another 10 years at least. And then I opened her stomach. It was full of pills. Not partially dissolved, not in the process of being digested. Whole pills, dozens of them, maybe 100 or more, sitting in her stomach like she'd swallowed them all at once right before she died. I emptied the stomach contents into an examination tray and started sorting through them. They were all the same type, small white tablets with no markings. I'd need to send them to the lab for identification, but my first thought was sleeping pills or some kind of sedative. This looked like a suicide, but something about it felt wrong. If Eleanor had wanted to kill herself, why do it in an abandoned house? Why not at home, in her own bed, surrounded by her own things? And if she'd taken a fatal dose of pills, why did she look so peaceful? Most overdose victims show some signs of distress, vomiting, convulsions, something. Eleanor looked like she'd simply sat down at a table and decided to stop living. I continued the examination, checking for anything else unusual. Her brain showed no abnormalities, no hemorrhage, no signs of stroke or seizure. Her other organs were all consistent with natural aging. The only thing that stood out was the stomach full of pills. I was finishing up the internal exam when I noticed something odd about her hands. I'd seen it during the external examination, but hadn't paid much attention. Her fingertips were stained with something dark, like ink or dye. I'd assumed it was just post-mortem discoloration, but looking closer now I could see it was too uniform, too concentrated on just the fingertips. I took scrapings from under her nails and from the stained skin. Under the microscope I could see particles of something dark and granular. Not ink. Soil. She had soil embedded in her fingertips, ground in deep, like she'd been digging in dirt with her bare hands. I went back to the photographs I'd taken at the Peterson house, looked at the kitchen table, the newspaper, Eleanor's position. I hadn't noticed any dirt on the table, no soil on the floor. The kitchen had been clean, so where had the dirt come from? I checked her shoes. They were clean too, no mud, no grass stains, but when I examined the soles under magnification, I found traces of the same dark soil embedded in the treads. She'd been walking on dirt recently, somewhere with dark, rich earth. Not the hard-packed clay we have around here. This was different. Garden soil, maybe, or something older. I collected samples of everything and made notes for my report. Cause of death appeared to be overdose, manner of death likely suicide, but pending toxicology results. I'd send the pills to the state lab for identification, along with the soil samples, and hopefully get some answers. I covered Eleanor's body with a sheet and started cleaning up. It was almost 6 p.m. and I was alone in the building, the way I usually am when I work late. The morgue is in the basement and the sounds from upstairs don't carry down here very well. It's quiet, isolated. Just me and the dead. I was washing my instruments when I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking across the floor of the main office. I stopped and listened. The building should have been empty. Everyone went home at 5. The footsteps continued, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other. Then they stopped, directly above me. I stood there, water running in the sink, listening to the silence. After a moment, the footsteps started again, heading toward the stairs that led down to the basement. I dried my hands and walked to the morgue door, opening it and looking out into the hallway. The stairwell was at the far end, maybe 30 feet away. I could hear the footsteps on the stairs now, coming down slowly. "Hello?" I called out. "Building's closed." The footsteps stopped. The stairwell was dark, the lights up there on a timer that had already shut them off for the night. I couldn't see anyone. Is someone there? No answer, just silence and the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway. I walked toward the stairs, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. When I reached the stairwell, I flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered on, illuminating the narrow stairs leading up to the first floor. Nobody was there. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment, looking up. Then I heard it again, faint, but distinct. Footsteps above me, in the main office. Walking slowly, purposefully, like someone was pacing back and forth. I went up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The main office was dark except for the emergency exit lights. I hit the overhead lights and they buzzed to life, flooding the room with harsh white light. The office was empty, desks neat, chairs pushed in, everything in its place. But the air felt wrong. It was cold, much colder than it should have been. And there was that smell again, the sweet, floral scent I'd noticed during the autopsy. Perfume. Old-fashioned perfume, like something my grandmother used to wear. I checked every room on the first floor. All empty. All locked from the inside. I was definitely alone in the building. I went back downstairs, telling myself I'd imagined it. Old buildings make noises. Pipes expand and contract. Wood settles. All kinds of sounds that can be mistaken for footsteps if you're alone and your nerves are already on edge. But I locked the morgue door behind me anyway, just to be safe. I finished cleaning up and sat down to write my preliminary report. The cause of death section was straightforward enough, but when I got to the narrative portion, describing the scene where the body was found, I found myself hesitating. There was something about the Peterson house that bothered me, something I couldn't quite articulate. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for the property records. The house had been built in 1967, purchased by Robert and Carol Peterson in 1968. They'd lived there for 42 years before the bank foreclosed in 2014. According to public records, they'd moved to Florida after that, trying to start over in their 70s. Robert had died 6 months later. Heart attack. Carol was in a nursing home in Tampa. I searched for Eleanor Marsh next. There wasn't much. She'd lived in town her whole life, widowed young when her husband died in a car accident in 1972. No children. She'd worked as a secretary at the courthouse until she retired 15 years ago. Quiet life, unremarkable, the kind of person who lives and dies without making much of a ripple. But something had brought her to that empty house. Something had made her sit down at that kitchen table with a newspaper full of obituaries and a photograph of the Peterson family and swallow enough pills to kill herself. I looked at the photograph again, the one I'd bagged as evidence. The young couple, so happy, standing in front of their new home. Carol with her hand on her pregnant belly. Pregnant. I pulled up the obituaries section of the newspaper, the one that had been on the table in front of Eleanor. Looked at the names she'd circled. Marcus Webb, Linda Doyle, James Pritchard. And there were others too, names I hadn't paid attention to before. Beth Ann Morrison, dead at 47. Tommy Granger, dead at 39. Sarah Lynn Fisher, dead at 52. I searched for each name, cross-referencing with birth records, and I found the connection. They were all born in 1969. All of them. Every single person Eleanor had circled in that newspaper had been born the same year. The year after Robert and Carol Peterson moved into that house. The year Carol would have given birth. I felt cold. I pulled up more records, searching through old newspaper archives, birth announcements, anything I could find. And there it was. Carol Peterson had given birth to a daughter in March of 1969, Elizabeth Ann Peterson, born March 15th, died March 18th, 3 days old, sudden infant death syndrome. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Eleanor Marsh had been sitting in that empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of the Peterson family, circling the obituaries of everyone born the year their baby died. Why? I searched for Eleanor's history, looking for any connection to the Petersons, and I found it in an old courthouse record. Eleanor Marsh, née Eleanor Brennan, had worked as a nurse at County General Hospital in 1969. She'd been there the night Elizabeth Ann Peterson died. My hands were shaking as I pulled up more records. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I felt like I was close to understanding something important. The medical records from 1969 were sparse, most of them not digitized, but I found a brief notation in the hospital log. Baby Peterson, admitted March 16th, discharged March 17th, readmitted March 18th, deceased. Attending nurse, E. Brennan. Eleanor had been there. She'd been the nurse taking care of Elizabeth Peterson when she died. I heard the footsteps again, directly above me. Slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. I looked up at the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I didn't call out this time. I just listened. The footsteps walked the length of the ceiling, then stopped. Right above where I was sitting, right above the examination table where Eleanor Marsh's body lay under a white sheet. I stood up slowly and walked over to the table, pulled back the sheet. Eleanor looked the same as she had an hour ago. Dead, decomposing, at peace. But that smell was stronger now, the sweet floral perfume mixing with the odor of decay. And then I saw it, on her right hand, the one that had been near the pen at the Peterson house. Her fingers had moved, just slightly, just enough that I could tell they weren't in the same position they'd been in when I covered her. The index finger was extended now, pointing at her own chest. I should have left. I should have walked out of that morgue and called someone, anyone, told them I needed backup or help or just another person in the room with me. But I didn't. I pulled my gloves back on and I looked at what she was pointing to. On her chest, right over her heart, was a mark I hadn't noticed during the autopsy, a small discoloration, almost like a birthmark, but too perfect. A tiny handprint, the kind a newborn baby would make, all the fingers splayed out, pressed into the skin like a stamp. I touched it with one gloved finger, and the skin was ice cold. Colder than the rest of her body, colder than it should have been even accounting for the refrigeration. And wet. The mark was wet, like it was weeping fluid from deep inside. I pulled my hand back and the smell of perfume got stronger, overwhelming now, filling the entire room, so thick I could taste it. And underneath it, something else. Baby powder. The smell of baby powder and milk and all the soft, sweet smells of an infant. The lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. I looked at Eleanor's face and her eyes were open. Just slightly, just a crack, but definitely open when they'd been closed a moment before. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't possible. I'd examined her. She was dead. She'd been dead for 2 weeks, but her chest was moving, rising and falling, slowly, like she was breathing. I watched in horror as her hand moved again, fingers curling into a fist, then relaxing. Her head turned slightly on the table, just a few degrees, until she was facing me. Her eyes opened wider, and I could see them now, clouded with death, but definitely looking at me. Her mouth moved. No sound came out at first, just her lips forming words, her jaw working. Then, so quiet I almost couldn't hear it, a whisper, "I'm sorry." The lights went out. Complete darkness, the emergency lights taking a moment to kick in. When they did, bathing the room in dim red light, Eleanor was still. Eyes closed, mouth shut, exactly as she should be. I stood there shaking, trying to process what I'd seen, what I thought I'd seen. Trying to convince myself it was exhaustion, stress, some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours alone with the dead. But I knew better. I'd seen what I'd seen. I covered her up again and left the morgue, locked it behind me, went upstairs and sat in the dark office, watching the clock on the wall tick away the hours until dawn. I didn't go back down there, not that night. When morning came, I called Sheriff Davis and told him I'd finished the preliminary autopsy. Cause of death: overdose, likely suicide. He asked if there was anything suspicious, and I told him no. Nothing suspicious. Just an old woman who'd decided to end her life in an empty house for reasons I couldn't determine. I didn't mention the pills, or the soil, or the connection to the Peterson baby. I didn't mention the footsteps, or the smell, or Eleanor's eyes opening in the dark. I just filled out the paperwork and released the body to the funeral home. The toxicology report came back 3 weeks later. The pills were a barbiturate, an old-fashioned sleeping medication that hadn't been prescribed in decades. The dosage in her stomach was more than enough to kill her several times over. Cause of death confirmed: intentional overdose. Case closed. But I kept the soil samples, sent them to a private lab for analysis, paid for it out of my own pocket. The report came back saying it was cemetery soil, specifically soil consistent with grave sites that had been disturbed and refilled. It had traces of coffin wood, embalming fluid, and human decomposition. I went to the cemetery on the edge of town and found Elizabeth Ann Peterson's grave. A small marker, worn smooth by weather and time. The grass around it was disturbed recently, like someone had been digging there. Not deep enough to reach the coffin, just surface level, enough to get soil on their hands and under their fingernails. Eleanor had been there, had knelt in front of this grave and dug in the dirt with her bare hands. And then she'd gone to the Peterson house and swallowed enough pills to stop her heart. I stood there looking at that tiny gravestone, and I understood. Not everything, but enough. Eleanor had been the nurse when Elizabeth Peterson died. Had been there that night 56 years ago when a 3-day-old baby stopped breathing. Had been there when Carol Peterson screamed and Robert Peterson wept, and their whole life shattered. And Eleanor had been carrying it with her ever since. Whatever happened that night, whatever she did or didn't do, it had stayed with her. Had grown over the years into something unbearable. And she'd spent her final days visiting the graves of all the people who'd been born that year, the year Elizabeth should have lived. Circling their obituaries, marking their deaths, keeping count. And then she'd gone to the house where it all started, and she'd ended it. I visit Eleanor's grave sometimes. It's not far from Elizabeth's, just a few rows over. The marker is simple, just her name and dates. No one comes to leave flowers. No family, no friends, no one to remember her. But I remember her lying on my examination table with that tiny handprint over her heart. I remember her eyes opening in the dark. I remember her whisper, "I'm sorry." I don't know what she did. I don't know if she made a mistake that night in 1969, or if she simply bore witness to a tragedy and never forgave herself for not preventing it. I'll never know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the morgue, I smell that perfume again, sweet and floral and old-fashioned, and I hear footsteps above me, pacing back and forth like someone walking a crying baby. And I know that Eleanor Marsh finally got the forgiveness she was looking for. Just not from the living. We don't get many fires in this town. Maybe 1 or 2 a year, usually someone's garage or a kitchen grease fire that got out of hand. The volunteer fire department is good at what they do. Fast response. Everyone knows everyone. The kind of small-town efficiency that comes from caring about your neighbors. So, when the old Hendricks farmhouse went up in flames on a Saturday night in November, half the town showed up to watch. I got the call around midnight from Fire Chief Morrison. They'd found a body in the remains of the house, burned beyond recognition, and they needed me to come out and examine it before they moved anything. Standard procedure in cases like this. Determine if the person was alive when the fire started. Look for signs of foul play. Make sure it's not a murder disguised as an accident. The farmhouse was 8 miles outside town, at the end of a dirt road that wound through fields of dead corn stalks. The Hendricks family had owned that land for 4 generations, but the last of them, Martin Hendricks, had died 2 years ago at 91. The property had been in probate ever since, the house sitting empty while distant relatives argued over who inherited what. Nobody had lived there in years. I could see the glow against the sky long before I reached the property. By the time I pulled up, the fire was mostly out, just smoldering ruins and the occasional flare-up when the firefighters hit a pocket of something still burning. The house had collapsed in on itself. Nothing left but the stone foundation and piles of charred timber. Morrison met me as I got out of the van. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from smoke. "It's bad," he said. "Whoever was in there didn't get out." "Any idea who?" He shook his head. "House has been empty for 2 years. Could be a vagrant, someone looking for shelter. Or kids, maybe, messing around where they shouldn't be." We walked toward what was left of the building. The heat was still intense, waves of it rolling off the rubble. The firefighters had created a perimeter with their trucks, lights illuminating the destruction. The smell of burned wood mixed with something else, something sweet and terrible that I recognized immediately. "Where's the body?" Morrison pointed to the center of the ruins, where the main floor had collapsed into the basement. "Down there. We can't get to it yet, too hot. But we could see it from above before everything fell in. Human-shaped, definitely. Right in the middle of what used to be the living room." I looked at the ruins, trying to picture the layout of the house from what was left. The stone foundation was intact, the basement walls still standing. Everything above that was gone, reduced to ash and charred beams. What started it? Don't know yet. We'll do a full investigation once it cools down, but it went up fast. Too fast. Neighbor about a mile away saw flames around 11:30. We got here by 11:45 and the whole structure was already fully involved. That kind of spread usually means accelerant. Arson? Maybe. Or maybe someone knocked over a kerosene lamp. Hard to say until we can examine the scene properly. He wiped his face with a rag, leaving more soot than he cleaned. "You'll need to wait a few hours before you can go in. We're cooling it down now, but the basement is still too hot." I nodded. "I'll get my equipment ready. Call me when it's safe." I went back to the van and started preparing. Evidence bags, camera, examination kit, all the tools I'd need to process a burned body. It's different from a regular autopsy, more archaeology than medicine. You have to be careful. Document everything. Because fire destroys evidence, and once you move something, you can't put it back the way it was. I was organizing my supplies when I noticed the crowd. Maybe 30 people standing in the field beyond the fire trucks, watching. Neighbors, I assumed, drawn by the flames and the commotion. Small town curiosity. I recognized a few faces in the firelight, but most were just shapes in the darkness. Morrison came back around 2 a.m. and said the basement had cooled enough for me to go in. They'd set up lights on portable stands, harsh white beams cutting through the darkness and illuminating the ruins. I pulled on my protective gear, heavy boots and flame-resistant coveralls, gloves, respirator mask. The air was still thick with smoke and ash, and I didn't want to breathe any more of it than necessary. I climbed down a ladder into what was left of the basement, Morrison behind me with the flashlight. The floor was covered in debris, chunks of burned wood and plaster, melted plastic, broken glass. The walls were blackened stone, still radiating heat. In the center of the space, surrounded by collapsed beams and ash, was the body. It was in a sitting position. That was the first thing that struck me. Most fire victims are found lying down. overcome by smoke before the flames reach them, or curled into a fetal position as their muscles contract from the heat. This person was sitting upright in what looked like a wooden chair, or what was left of one. The chair had mostly burned away, but the metal frame remained, and the body sat in it perfectly upright, arms resting on what would have been armrests, head tilted slightly back. The body itself was charred black, the skin completely burned away, the flesh underneath cooked and cracked. The face was unrecognizable, the features melted into a featureless mask. What hair might have remained was gone. The clothing was burned away, except for a few scraps of fabric that had somehow survived. From the size and build, I guessed male, maybe 5'10" or 6 feet, average weight. Beyond that, I couldn't tell anything without a proper examination. I started taking photographs documenting everything from multiple angles: the position of the body, the remains of the chair, the debris surrounding it. Morrison stood back, giving me room to work, his flashlight adding extra illumination. "Notice anything odd?" I asked. "Besides the sitting up part?" "Yeah, besides that." I pointed at the floor around the chair. "Look at the burn pattern." The floor was charred, covered in ash and debris, but there was a clear circle around the chair, maybe 3 feet in diameter, where the burning was less severe. The wood floor in that circle was blackened, but not completely destroyed, while everywhere else it had burned through to the dirt basement floor below. "It's like the fire didn't burn as hot right around the body," Morrison said, "or like something protected this spot." I crouched down, examining the circle more closely. "Did you find any evidence of accelerant?" "Not yet, but we haven't done the full analysis." I stood up and walked around the body, taking more photographs. Something was bothering me, but I couldn't articulate what it was, the way the person was sitting. So upright, so composed. The way the fire had burned around them but not consumed them completely. It felt staged somehow, intentional. I moved closer to examine the body itself. The heat had been intense enough to crack the skull, exposing the brain matter inside. The rib cage had collapsed slightly, the bones showing through the burned flesh. The hands were still gripping the armrests of the chair, the fingers curled around the metal, the bones visible through the charred skin. And then I saw the teeth. The jaw had fallen open slightly and I could see inside the mouth. The teeth were intact, which wasn't unusual. Teeth are the hardest substance in the body. They survive fires that destroy everything else. But these teeth were wrong. They were too white, too clean, like they'd been brushed recently. And they were arranged in a way that didn't match the skull's position, like the jaw had been opened deliberately, arranged to show them. I took close-up photographs of the mouth, using my flashlight to illuminate the interior. And I saw something else. On the tongue, or what was left of it, something small and metallic. I carefully reached in with tweezers and extracted it. It was a key. Small, brass, old-fashioned. The same kind of key I'd found in Eleanor Marsh's cardigan pocket 2 months ago. I held it up for Morrison to see. This was in the mouth. "What the hell?" He leaned closer, examining it. "Who puts a key in their mouth?" "Someone who wants it to survive the fire." I bagged the key as evidence. This was deliberate. Everything about this scene is deliberate. I continued the examination, checking the body for any other anomalies. The hands had no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. The bones showed no obvious fractures or trauma. If this person had died in the fire, they'd done so while sitting calmly in a chair, not trying to escape, not fighting for their life. We spent another hour in that basement, collecting evidence, documenting everything. By the time we were done, the sun was starting to come up, gray light filtering through the smoke still hanging in the air. We got the body loaded onto a gurney and into the van. I'd do the full examination at the morgue, but I already knew this wasn't a simple fire death. Back at the morgue, I laid the body out on the examination table. In the harsh fluorescent light, the damage looked even worse. The fire had destroyed so much that it was going to be difficult to determine cause of death. If the person was dead before the fire started, I might never know how they died. I started with X-rays, standard procedure for fire victims. You're looking for fractures, bullets, anything that might indicate trauma before the burning. The X-rays showed intact bones, no fractures, no foreign objects except for the key I'd already found. The skull was cracked from the heat, but the bones underneath were whole. I began the external examination, documenting every detail. The skin was completely burned away on most of the body, the muscle tissue underneath cooked and dry. But as I worked my way down the torso, I found something strange. On the chest, right over the heart, the burning was less severe. The skin here was charred but not completely destroyed, and I could see a pattern in it. I cleaned away some of the ash and debris and the pattern became clearer. It was a handprint, a large handprint, much larger than normal, pressed into the flesh like a brand. The fingers were elongated, the palm too wide, like whatever made this print wasn't quite human. I photographed it from every angle, then took measurements. From the tip of the middle finger to the base of the palm, the print measured almost 10 inches. A normal adult handprint is 6 to 7 inches. This was wrong. Impossible. I checked the rest of the body for similar marks and found them on the shoulders, the thighs, the back. Handprints, all of them too large, all of them burned into the flesh like brands, like something had been holding this person down while they burned. I stepped back from the table, my hands shaking slightly. In 17 years of doing this job, I'd never seen anything like this. Never seen marks that suggested something other than human had touched a body. I forced myself to continue. Cause of death, I reminded myself. That's what I was here to determine. Everything else was secondary. I opened the body cavity, a standard Y incision despite the burned skin. Inside, the organs were cooked, the heat having penetrated deep into the torso. The heart was shriveled and hard. The lungs were black with soot. The liver was dry and cracked. Everything looked like it should in a fire victim. But when I removed the heart and cut it open, I found something that shouldn't have been there. Inside the left ventricle was ash. Not soot from smoke inhalation, but ash. Fine, white ash, like cremated remains. It filled the chamber completely, packed in so tight I had to scrape it out. I collected it in a specimen container and examined it under the microscope. It was definitely cremation ash, the characteristic white color and powdery texture. But how did it get inside the heart? The heart is a closed system. There's no way for ash to enter it unless it was placed there deliberately, and that would require the person to be alive, their heart still beating, pumping the ash through their circulatory system. I checked the other organs. The lungs had ash in them too, but that was normal from smoke inhalation. The stomach was empty except for more of the white ash. The intestines were full of it. It was everywhere inside the body, like the person had been eating ash, breathing ash, their entire system saturated with it. I sat down at my desk and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A body burned in a fire, sitting upright in a chair, covered in impossible handprints, filled with cremation ash. None of it made sense. None of it fit any pattern I knew. I pulled out the key I'd found in the mouth and examined it more closely. It was old, the brass tarnished with age. There was an inscription on it, so small I needed a magnifying glass to read it. A single word, Hendrix. This was a Hendrix family key, which meant whoever this was, they were connected to the family somehow. But the last Hendrix had died 2 years ago. The house had been empty. So, who was this? I ran the dental records through the database, hoping for a match. Fire victims are often identified through dental records when fingerprints and facial features are destroyed, but I got no hits. Whoever this was, they weren't in the system. I was preparing to close the body when I heard it. A sound from somewhere in the building, faint but distinct, singing, a woman's voice, high and clear, singing something that might have been a hymn or a lullaby. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was old, the kind of song my grandmother might have known. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it and looking out into the hallway. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the main office. I climbed the stairs slowly, following the voice. It got louder as I approached, more distinct, and I could hear the words now. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. It was the children's rhyme, Ring Around the Rosy, but sung slowly, mournfully, like a dirge. I reached the top of the stairs and the singing stopped. The office was empty, all the lights off, the morning sun streaming through the windows. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. Then I went back downstairs, telling myself I'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, too many hours alone with a body that didn't make sense. But when I got back to the morgue, the body had moved. Not much, just slightly. The head that had been tilted back was now facing forward, looking directly at the door. The arms that had been at the sides were now crossed over the chest, hands folded like the person was laid out for a funeral. I froze in the doorway, staring at the table. I knew I hadn't positioned the body that way. I'd left it open, mid-examination, organs exposed. But now it was closed up, the skin pulled back together, the arms crossed. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. The body was still charred, still burned, but something about it looked different, more peaceful somehow, less like a victim and more like someone resting. I checked the sutures I'd made for the Y incision. They were gone. The skin was sealed, not sewn, but fused, like it had healed. But that was impossible. Dead tissue doesn't heal. Dead bodies don't move themselves. I reached out with one gloved hand to touch the chest, and the skin was warm. Not room temperature, not the cool of dead flesh. Warm, like there was still heat inside, still some spark of life. I jerked my hand back, and the body's eyes opened. They were black, completely black. No white, no iris, just solid black like pools of ink. They fixed on me and the mouth opened, the jaw dropping wider than it should have been able to, and that voice came out again. The singing voice I'd heard upstairs, but coming from this burned throat, this ruined mouth. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the morgue into darkness. I stumbled backward, knocking over my instrument tray, the metal tools clattering on the floor. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in red, and the body was sitting up on the table. Not just sitting. Standing. The burned corpse was standing on the examination table. Those black eyes still fixed on me, the mouth still open in that impossible grin. The hands reached out toward me, the charred fingers elongated, stretching like they were made of rubber, reaching across the space between us. I ran. Didn't think, didn't process, just turned and ran for the door. Got into the hallway and slammed it behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I pressed my back against the door and slid down to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The building was completely silent. No singing, no movement, just the usual hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, to unlock the door, to look inside. The body was back on the table, exactly where I'd left it. Arms at the sides, head tilted back, eyes closed. The instruments I'd knocked over were still on the floor. Everything was normal except for one thing. On the chest, where those impossible handprints had been, there was new writing, burned into the flesh in precise, careful letters. Come home. I called Sheriff Davis and told him I needed help processing the scene. Didn't tell him why, just said I had some anomalies I couldn't explain and I wanted a second opinion. He came down with Deputy Chen and they helped me finish the examination. They didn't see anything unusual. No handprints, no writing, no ash inside the organs. According to their observations, it was a straightforward fire death, probably accidental, probably a vagrant who'd broken into the empty house looking for shelter. But I knew what I'd seen. I had photographs of those handprints, measurements of that writing. I had the samples of ash I'd collected from inside the heart. I had the key with the Hendricks name on it. The toxicology report came back negative. No drugs, no alcohol, no carbon monoxide poisoning. The person had been alive when the fire started and had remained conscious through it, sitting in that chair while they burned. I sent the ash samples to 3 different labs. They all came back with the same result. Human cremation ash, approximately 50 years old based on the degradation of the bone fragments. The DNA was too degraded to identify who it had come from. The dental records finally gave us an ID, but not through the database. Morrison found an old file in the fire department archives, a house fire from 1974. The Hendricks farmhouse, same property, had burned once before. Martin Hendricks' wife, Catherine, had died in that fire. Her dental records were in the file. They matched. The body in my morgue was Catherine Hendricks, who had been dead and cremated 50 years ago. I went back to the farmhouse ruins the next day, searched through the debris in daylight, looking for anything I might have missed. And I found it in the basement, in the exact spot where we'd found the body. A wooden box, fireproof, the kind people use for important documents. Inside was a collection of keys, maybe 20 of them, all brass, all old-fashioned. Each one had a name inscribed on it. Family names from the town. Peterson, Marsh, Webb, Doyle, all the names I'd seen before in Eleanor Marsh's newspaper. And at the bottom of the box was a photograph. The Hendricks family, taken in 1968. Martin and Catherine standing in front of their farmhouse, surrounded by a group of other people. Young couples, all of them, all smiling at the camera. I recognized some of the faces from other photographs I'd seen. Robert and Carol Peterson, Eleanor Brennan before she married and became Eleanor Marsh. On the back of the photo, someone had written in careful script, "The Circle, 1968. I don't know what they were. I don't know what they did in that farmhouse 50 years ago. But I know that Catherine Hendricks came back, filled with the ashes of whatever burned there in 1974. I know she sat in that chair and burned again, and I know she left a message for someone. Come home. The key I found in her mouth fits the box. I've checked, and sometimes, late at night, I take it out and look at it, and I wonder who it's meant for. Who's supposed to come home? Who's next? The other keys in that box are still there, in my evidence locker. 20 keys, 20 names, 20 families who were part of something called the Circle. And I keep finding them. The bodies. Not burned anymore, but marked somehow. A woman drowned with lungs full of ancient water. An old woman with soil under her fingernails and a stomach full of pills. A man in my morgue right now with something I can't explain. They're all connected. I know they are. And whatever started in 1968 isn't finished yet. I can feel it every time I walk into this morgue. Every time I hear footsteps above me or smell perfume or hear singing. Something is calling them home, one by one. and I'm terrified that when the last key finds its owner, I'll finally understand what the circle really was. But I'm more terrified that I won't. There are some deaths you can see coming from a mile away. The 90-year-old with congestive heart failure. The lifelong smoker with stage 4 lung cancer. The diabetic who stopped taking insulin. You document them, file the paperwork, and move on because there's nothing surprising about a body that wore out exactly the way you'd expect it to. Then there are the others, the ones that don't make sense no matter how many times you go over the evidence. The ones that keep you up at night, replaying every detail, looking for the thing you missed. The thing that would make it all click into place. James Carpenter was one of those. I'd known him casually, the way you know people in a town this size. He ran the pharmacy on Main Street, had for 20 years. 54 years old, married, 2 kids in college. Reliable, professional. The kind of man who remembered your name and asked about your family when you came in to pick up a prescription. He'd filled medications for half the town, including mine. Blood pressure pills, nothing serious, just maintenance for getting older. He disappeared on a Monday. His wife Linda called it in Tuesday morning when he didn't come home from work. His car was still in the pharmacy parking lot, the store locked up properly, everything in order. His wallet and keys were in his desk drawer. His phone was on the counter, plugged in and charging. He'd simply vanished sometime between closing the store at 6 p.m. and whenever someone noticed he was gone. Sheriff Davis organized search parties. They combed through the town, checked the woods around the pharmacy, dragged Mercy Lake even though there was no reason to think he'd gone there. Nothing. No sign of James Carpenter anywhere. Until Thursday morning, when a jogger found him in Riverside Park. The park sits at the north end of town, about 2 miles from the pharmacy. It's a small municipal park, nothing fancy, just a few benches, a gazebo, a playground for kids. The jogger had cut through on her morning run and found James sitting on a bench facing the river, perfectly still, staring at the water. She'd called out to him, asked if he was okay. He didn't respond. She got closer and realized something was wrong. His skin was gray. His eyes were open but not moving, not blinking. She called 911 and by the time the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what she already knew. James Carpenter was dead. Had been dead for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. Sitting upright on that park bench, hands folded in his lap, looking out at the river like he was waiting for something. I got the call around 9 a.m. Davis met me at the park. His face drawn and tired. The whole town had been looking for James. Finding him like this, dead on a park bench 2 miles from where he'd disappeared, wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for. No signs of trauma, Davis said as we walked toward the bench. Paramedics said it looked like he just sat down and died. Could be a heart attack, a stroke, something like that. I could see the bench from 50 feet away. James was still sitting there, the paramedics having left him in place once they confirmed he was deceased. They knew to leave everything for me to document. From a distance, he looked almost normal, a man resting on a park bench, enjoying the view. Up close, it was different. His skin had that waxy, pale quality that comes a few hours after death. Rigor mortis had set in, locking him in that upright position, hands folded, spine straight. But his face was wrong. His eyes were open, fixed on the river, but the pupils were completely dilated. Both of them fully dilated, leaving just a thin ring of color around the black. Like he'd died in complete darkness instead of broad daylight on a park bench. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his mouth was slightly open and I could see his tongue. It was black, not the purple black of cyanosis, not the dark red of blood pooling after death. Black, like it had been stained with ink or dye. I pulled on gloves and began the preliminary examination. Body temperature was ambient, which made determining time of death difficult. Rigor was fully established, suggesting he'd been dead at least 12 hours. Lividity was fixed on his back and buttocks, consistent with sitting upright. All normal so far. I checked his hands. No defensive wounds, no bruising, no signs of struggle. His fingernails were clean. His clothing was neat, the same outfit his wife said he'd worn to work Monday morning. A blue button-down shirt, khaki pants, brown shoes. Everything looked normal except for one detail. His shoes were on the wrong feet. The left shoe on the right foot, the right shoe on the left. They were tied neatly, no scuff marks, no indication he'd walked very far in them, like someone had put them on him after he died and hadn't noticed the mistake. Did the paramedics move him at all? I asked Davis. No, they checked for vitals and left him exactly as they found him. Why? I pointed to the shoes. Davis looked and his expression darkened. Jesus, who puts shoes on backwards? Someone who wasn't paying attention, or someone who didn't care. I photographed the shoes, then continued the examination. Help me check his pockets. We went through his clothing carefully. Nothing in the pants pockets, no wallet, no keys, no phone. The shirt pocket had a pen and a small notepad, the kind pharmacists use to jot down notes. I flipped through it. The last entry was dated Monday, a reminder to reorder a specific medication. Nothing unusual, but tucked into the back of the notepad was a photograph. Old, faded, the colors washed out. It showed a group of people standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. Men and women in their 30s and 40s, all dressed formally, all smiling at the camera. I recognized some of the faces. Robert Peterson, Catherine Hendricks, Eleanor Marsh, looking young and hopeful. And in the center of the group, standing slightly apart from the others, was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with dark hair, and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera with an intensity that made me uncomfortable even in a photograph. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "The Circle, 1968. Never forget." I showed it to Davis. He studied it for a long moment. "That's the Peterson guy, and that's Catherine Hendricks. Both dead now. Who are the others?" "I don't know, but I've seen this photo before, or one like it." I thought about the fireproof box in my evidence locker, the 20 keys with 20 names. I need to get him back to the morgue. There's more going on here than a simple heart attack. We loaded James onto the gurney and into the van. As we were preparing to leave, I looked back at the park bench where he'd been sitting. There was a dark stain on the wood, right where his body had been. I walked over and touched it with my gloved finger. It was wet, sticky, and when I brought my finger up to the light, I saw it was black, the same black as his tongue. I collected a sample and labeled it. Then I noticed something else. On the bench, carved into the wood in letters so small I'd almost missed them. 5 down, 15 to go. I photographed it, documented it, and didn't mention it to Davis. I was starting to understand a pattern, starting to see connections that I didn't want to believe. But I needed more evidence before I could articulate what I was thinking. Back at the morgue, I laid James out on the examination table and began the full autopsy. External examination first, documenting everything I'd noted at the scene. The dilated pupils, the black tongue, the shoes on the wrong feet. I removed his clothing carefully, bagging each item. Underneath his shirt, on his chest, directly over his heart, was a mark. I'd seen it before. A circular discoloration, darker than the surrounding skin, about the size of a silver dollar. And in the center of it, barely visible, a keyhole. Not a wound, not a scar. A keyhole, burned or branded into the skin in perfect detail. I photographed it from every angle, measured it, took samples of the discolored tissue. Then I began the internal examination. The Y incision opened him up, and immediately I smelled something wrong. Not the usual smell of decay or bodily fluids, something chemical, acrid, like burning plastic or melting rubber. It was coming from inside his chest cavity. I removed the sternum and looked inside. Everything appeared normal at first. Heart, lungs, all the organs in their proper places, normal size and color. But when I touched the heart, it felt wrong, too hard, too rigid. I removed it and set it on the examination tray. The heart was petrified. I don't mean figuratively, I mean literally turned to stone. The muscle tissue had somehow mineralized, transformed into something that looked and felt like polished granite. It was impossible, but there it was in my hands, a heart that weighed 3 times what it should have weighed, hard and cold and completely inorganic. I set it down carefully and checked the other organs. The lungs were normal, the liver was normal, the kidneys were normal. Only the heart had changed, transformed into stone while the rest of the body remained flesh. I cut into the heart with a bone saw, the only tool I had that could penetrate the surface. Inside, the chambers were visible, perfectly preserved in stone, and in the left ventricle, exactly where I'd found Ash and Catherine Hendricks, was a key. The same brass key I'd been finding in all of them. Old-fashioned, tarnished with age. I extracted it carefully and read the inscription, Carpenter. His own name. James Carpenter had died with his own key inside his heart. I continued the autopsy, documenting everything, collecting samples. The stomach was empty except for a small amount of fluid. I collected it for analysis. The intestines were normal. The brain showed no abnormalities, no hemorrhage, no signs of stroke or trauma. Cause of death should have been cardiac arrest, the heart simply stopping. But how do you explain a heart turning to stone? How do you write that in an official report without sounding insane? I was cleaning up when I heard the voice. Not singing this time. Speaking. A man's voice, low and calm, coming from somewhere in the building. 5 down. I froze, listening. The voice came again, closer now. 15 to go. I walked to the morgue door and looked out into the hallway. Nothing. Empty corridor. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. I called out, but got no response. I went back to the examination table and James Carpenter was looking at me. His eyes had moved, tracking my movement across the room. The pupils were still fully dilated, black pools that reflected nothing. His mouth opened slowly, the jaw working, and that voice came out again. Not his voice. Something else using his vocal cords like an instrument. The circle must close. I backed away from the table, my hands shaking. You're dead. You can't be talking. The body sat up, slowly, stiffly, rigor mortis making the movement jerky and unnatural. The arms that had been at the sides lifted, the hands reaching toward me, and I could see the fingers were changing. Elongating, the bones stretching, the skin splitting to accommodate the growth. The circle must close, the voice said again, and this time other voices joined it. Women's voices, men's voices, all speaking in unison. The debt must be paid. The lights flickered. The fluorescent tubes buzzed and popped, plunging the room into darkness for a moment before the emergency lights kicked in. In the red glow, James Carpenter stood from the table, his chest still open, the petrified heart visible in the cavity. I ran for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. Locked from the outside, though there was no one out there to lock it. I spun around and the body was closer now, moving with impossible speed, those elongated fingers reaching for me. I grabbed a scalpel from the instrument tray and held it up, knowing it was useless but unable to think of anything else to do. The body stopped, tilted its head, and laughed. The sound came from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, filling the small room with mocking amusement. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," the voices said. The circle began in 1968, 20 families, 20 promises, 20 debts that must be paid before the door can close. "What door?" I managed to ask. "What are you talking about?" The body leaned closer and I could smell that chemical smell again. Stronger now, overwhelming. The door they opened, the door they cannot close. Each death is a key. Each key turns the lock. When all 20 turn, the door will seal, and what came through will return. "What came through? What are you?" The body smiled, James Carpenter's face stretching into an expression that was almost, but not quite human. "We are the price. We are what was owed. And you—" The finger pointed at me, long and skeletal now, more bone than flesh. "You are the witness. You must document. You must record. You must remember." Remember what? That some doors should never be opened. That some bargains cannot be broken. That what they did in 1968 must be undone, one death at a time, one key at a time, until all 20 have paid. The lights came back on, bright and sudden. I squinted against the glare, and when my vision adjusted, James Carpenter was back on the table. Eyes closed, mouth shut, arms at his sides. Dead. Completely dead. The chest cavity was still open, the petrified heart still visible, but otherwise everything looked normal. I stood there gasping, my back pressed against the door, the scalpel still clutched in my hand. Had I imagined it? Hallucinated the whole thing? Stress, exhaustion, too many impossible deaths breaking something in my mind. But the door was still locked. I hadn't locked it. And when I checked the examination table, there were wet footprints on the floor. Footprints leading from the table to where I stood, made by bare feet even though James Carpenter's shoes were still on his feet. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and got out of that room. Went upstairs to my office and sat there until dawn, watching the sky gradually lighten, trying to process what I'd seen and heard. The toxicology report came back negative. The fluid from his stomach was just water, nothing unusual. The tissue samples from the heart confirmed what I'd seen. Mineralization of cardiac tissue through an unknown process. The pathologist at the state lab called me personally to ask if it was some kind of joke. I told him no joke, just something I couldn't explain. I went back to my evidence locker and pulled out the fireproof box with the 20 keys. Laid them out on my desk and matched each one to the names inscribed on them. Peterson, Hendricks, Marsh, Porter, Carpenter. 5 keys for 5 deaths. I pulled up the photograph from 1968, the one labeled The Circle. 20 people standing in front of a building I still didn't recognize. I started researching, cross-referencing names with obituaries and birth records and property deeds. It took me 3 days, but I found them all. 20 families. 20 people who'd been part of something called The Circle in 1968. And I found the building in the photograph. It was an old church on the outskirts of town, torn down in 1975 to make way for a highway that was never built. The church records were stored in the county archives. I spent a full day going through them, looking for any mention of The Circle. I found it in a folder marked Closed Congregations, 1968. It was a group, a prayer group supposedly. 20 families who met every week at that church, studying something they called the deeper mysteries. The pastor's notes were vague, concerned. He'd written about strange requests they'd made, access to the church basement, permission to conduct private ceremonies, questions about ancient texts and forbidden practices. The last entry was dated October 1968. The pastor had written, "I have denied their requests and asked them to leave the church. What they seek is not of God." I pray they abandon this foolishness before something terrible happens. 1 month later, the church burned down. Arson, ruled accidental, never solved. The pastor died in the fire. The 20 families of the Circle were questioned, but never charged. And 2 months after that, the first child was born, Elizabeth Ann Peterson, followed by 19 others over the next year. All born healthy, all dying within days or weeks. SIDS, unexplained, tragic. 20 families, 20 dead infants, 20 funerals in 1969. I sat in the archives reading room with these old files spread out in front of me, and I understood. They'd been trying to bring something through. Some entity, some force, something that required a sacrifice. They'd offered their unborn children, and whatever they'd summoned had taken what was owed. But the door they'd opened hadn't closed. For 56 years, whatever came through had been waiting, and now it was calling them home, one by one, taking what they'd promised all those years ago. 5 down, 15 to go. I put the files back and drove to Riverside Park. Stood in front of the bench where James Carpenter had died. The stain was still there, black and wet, even days later, and carved into the wood. 5 down, 15 to go. I thought about the 15 people still alive from that photograph. 15 families who'd participated in whatever ritual they'd performed in 1968. 15 people who'd offered their children to something dark and hungry. And I thought about my role in all this, the witness, the one who documents and records and remembers. I went back to the morgue and looked at the 5 keys on my desk. Held each one, felt the weight of them, the age of them. They were warm to the touch, warmer than they should have been. And if I listened very carefully, I could hear something. A faint sound, like breathing, coming from inside the metal. I have a theory now. Each death releases a key. Each key holds a piece of whatever came through that door in 1968. And when all 20 keys are collected, when all 20 members of the Circle have paid their debt, the door will finally close, and whatever has been waiting will return to wherever it came from. Or it will be free. I don't know which. What I do know is that I've found 3 more bodies since James Carpenter. Barbara Henley, drowned in her bathtub with lungs full of water that wasn't from any tap or lake in this county. Thomas Wright, suffocated in his sleep with fibers in his trachea that matched nothing in our database. Susan Monroe, poisoned by a substance that doesn't exist in any chemical catalog I can find. 8 down, 12 to go. Each one had a key. Each one had that mark over their heart, the keyhole burned into their flesh. Each one died in a way that defied explanation, that left me filing reports I know sound insane. And each time I hear that voice, in the morgue, late at night, when I'm alone with the bodies. The Circle must close, the debt must be paid. I've stopped going home most nights. I sleep in my office if I sleep at all. I keep the keys in my desk drawer and I take them out sometimes, hold them, try to understand what they mean. Last week, I found my own name in those church records. Not my name exactly, but my father's. He was part of the Circle. He was one of the 20 who stood in that photograph in 1968, who participated in whatever ritual they performed. He died when I was 3 years old. Car accident, sudden and tragic. My mother never talked about it much. I was raised by my grandmother, became a doctor, became a coroner. Spent my life documenting death without ever understanding that I was connected to all of this from the beginning. I went to my father's grave yesterday, stood there looking at his headstone, dated 1971. He was the first to die, 3 years after the ritual. Before I was born. Before he could see what his choice had cost him. And carved into the base of his headstone, so small I'd never noticed it before, 0. The witness must remain. I'm not part of the 20. I'm something else. The one who was meant to survive. The one who was meant to document, to record, to remember. The one who will be there when the last key turns and the door finally closes or opens. I don't know which anymore. I don't know if the deaths I'm documenting are keys to seal that door or keys to unlock it completely. I don't know if I'm witnessing the end of something terrible or the beginning of something worse. What I know is this: there are 12 keys left to find, 12 more deaths that will make no sense, 12 more bodies that will sit up on my examination table and speak with voices that aren't their own. And when it's done, when all 20 keys are collected, I'll finally understand what my father was part of, what he brought into this world, what he left for me to clean up. The circle must close, they say. The debt must be paid. I just hope that when it does, when that final key turns in that final lock, I'm ready for what comes through, or what goes back. But I have a feeling I won't be. Nobody could be ready for that. Sometimes, late at night, I take all the keys out and lay them on my desk. 8 of them now, brass and old and warm to the touch. I arrange them in a circle and I watch them, waiting for them to do something, to reveal something, to show me what I'm supposed to do. And sometimes, if I stare at them long enough, I can see things reflected in the metal. Not my face. Other faces. The faces of the 20 from that photograph in 1968. All of them looking back at me. All of them waiting. And in the center of the circle of keys, just for a moment, I can see a door. Old wood. Brass handle. No lock visible from this side. Just a door standing alone in the darkness. And every time I see it, it's opening a little bit wider.